The Ironwood Saloon had been May Ford's for 27 years, and in that time she had come to understand the desert the way you understand a difficult marriage. Not with fondness exactly, but with a deep practiced knowledge of something you have chosen and kept choosing every single day since, regardless of what it cost you and regardless of what it gave back. It cost her plenty. It gave back the truth. That was what she always said when people asked why she stayed. Why a woman her age would plant herself in a cinder block building off a dying stretch of Route 66 in a town that the interstate had bypassed 30 years ago. And the economy had been bypassing ever since, where the nearest grocery store was 11 miles east and the nearest hospital was 43 miles west. And the summer heat came down like a lid being pressed on a jar, trapping everything inside it. She had been asked the question enough times to have her answer polished smooth. The desert doesn't let you hide. It just waits. Everything out here tells the truth eventually. She had said it so many times it had become almost involuntary, the way prayers become involuntary when you have said them long enough. But she was thinking it deliberately now, with something sharper underneath the habit, with the specific attention of a woman who has learned to trust her instincts enough to be afraid of them. It was a Tuesday in the last week of July. The thermometer above the register had read 109 degrees at noon. By 3 in the afternoon, it had pushed past 112. The kind of heat that didn't just press on you from outside, but got inside you, behind your eyes, and underneath your thinking, making everything feel slow and thick and slightly provisional, as if the ordinary world was hanging by a thread that the heat might burn through at any moment. The ironwood existed in that heat the way a ship exists in water, not comfortably, not elegantly, but completely, with the total embeddedness of something that has been in its element so long that separation would mean destruction. The bar had been open since 9 that morning. It would stay open until the last person left, which on Tuesdays was usually Hector Vales, the retired pipeline foreman, who occupied the far end of the counter and nursed the same beer for 3 hours while watching the small television mounted above the liquor shelf. Hector never caused trouble. He never said much. He tipped exactly 11% every single time, which May had calculated precisely enough to know, and she did not mind him for it because Hector was the kind of regular who made a place feel inhabited rather than haunted, and there was a difference, and the difference mattered. Today there was also old Pete Calloway at the table near the jukebox reading a paperback Western, the way he always did on Tuesdays, so thoroughly absorbed in someone else's fictional desert that he seemed genuinely unaware he was sitting in the middle of a real one. There were 2 truckers in the back booth, both northbound, both loud in the amiable, competitive way of men who had spent too much time alone in cab seats and were compensating. There was a young couple from Las Vegas who had taken the wrong exit off Interstate 40 and stopped in for cold water and ended up ordering lunch and now seemed in no particular hurry to leave, which May understood completely. And there was Andrew. Andrew Ford, aged 10, blonde-haired slight, with wrists that looked like they'd been made for a larger frame that hadn't arrived yet. He was sitting in the corner booth, the one tucked back from the jukebox, where the light came in softer and the road noise didn't hammer at you quite so directly. He had been coming to the Ironwood every afternoon for the past 3 weeks since school let out for the summer, and since his mother Dana had taken on double shifts at the truck stop diner 11 miles east and needed somewhere for him to go that wasn't a locked house alone in the July heat. May had known Dana Armstrong for 12 years, had known her husband William for nearly as long. He had been a careful man, methodical in the specific way of people whose minds naturally organize the world into columns and categories and cross-references, whose satisfaction comes from the moment a number settles where it belongs and the ledger closes clean. He kept other people's books. He drove 45 minutes each way to a client office in Barstow 3 times a week and did the rest of his work from a desk in the spare bedroom of their house in Needles. And he had a habit of double-checking his own calculations, even when no one was watching. Especially when no one was watching, as if accuracy were a private obligation rather than a professional one. William had died in February. Heart failure, the certificate said. Sudden, unexpected gone at 44. He had been alone in the kitchen when it happened, at the table where he did his bookkeeping with a cup of coffee, that had gone cold beside him, and nothing to explain the particular expression on his face that the paramedics described afterward as something between peace and profound relief. May had not known what to do with that detail when Dana told her. She still didn't exactly. What she knew was that Andrew had not cried at the funeral. He had stood beside his mother in the small desert cemetery with his hands folded at his sides and his face dry and a silver pendant gripped in his right fist so tightly that when he opened his hand afterward, there was a red mark across his palm in the precise shape of the chain. She had watched him do it from across the row of folding chairs. She had watched and understood without language that this boy was holding himself together with that piece of metal, that he had made it into the only thing that was allowed to know how he really felt, the only place his grief was permitted to go. She had not said anything. Some things you don't say. You say them by making sure the booth is ready and the orange juice is cold, and there is something warm coming out of the kitchen at noon, and you keep saying them every day, and you trust that the boy will understand. He did. The jukebox was playing something by Merle Haggard's Slow and Full of Road. The truckers were arguing about a way station outside Victorville. The Las Vegas couple was splitting a plate of onion rings and laughing at something on one of their phones. Hector was watching the television with the committed blankness of a man who has decided that whatever the news is, he has already accounted for it. Pete was deep inside his paperback turning pages with the mechanical certainty of a man who has read enough westerns to know that justice will arrive. It is only the timing that requires patience. May was wiping the counter. Andrew was in his booth. He had his sketchbook open in front of him, but he was not drawing. He was holding the pendant in both hands, turning it over. The way he always turned it over, not wearing it, not putting it away, just holding it, and running his thumb along the engraving on the back, with the focused, repetitive motion of someone trying to find a thing by touch that the mind has not yet been able to reach. The way you worry a rosary, not because you believe the beads will answer you, but because the act of reaching is the only thing available, and reaching is better than nothing. May had learned not to comment on the pendant. She had learned not to ask Andrew about it directly, not because she wasn't curious, but because she understood that some things have to make their own time, and that a careful boy like this one had reasons for everything he did, and those reasons belonged to him until he decided otherwise. She turned to rinse the rag in the sink, and the jukebox shifted to something slower. A Waylon Jennings song her own father had played on the record player in the kitchen of their house in Flagstaff when she was 8 years old so long ago that the memory had become more texture than image. The feeling of linoleum under bare feet, the smell of coffee, the low, warm sound of a man's voice coming through a speaker that needed its left channel adjusted. That was when it came, not a sound first, a sensation, a vibration that she felt in the soles of her feet through the concrete floor, low and rhythmic, and building with the unhurried certainty of something that has already decided where it is going. She thought for 3 seconds that it was a heavy rig on the highway, one of the long-haul doubles that moved through needles at all hours and made the windows hum. But it wasn't stopping. It wasn't passing. It was growing, layering on itself, multiplying from one register into many registers stacked on top of each other until the word sound no longer covered it adequately. It was more accurate to say that the Ironwood Saloon was being swallowed by something living, something vast and mechanical and entirely unhurriedly deliberate. Hector looked up from the television. One of the truckers stopped mid-sentence. The Las Vegas couple looked toward the window. Pete didn't look up from his book. Pete had been around long enough. May set down her rag. She walked to the front window and looked through the gap in the beer sign neon, through the smear of heat shimmer that turned the road into something liquid in the afternoon light, and she saw them coming down Route 66. The way weather comes, not fast, not rushing, but with the specific inevitability of something that the atmosphere has already decided on and the landscape has already accepted, and the only thing left is the arrival itself. A column of motorcycles stretching back further than she could count before the road bent out of sight, riding 2 by 2 in perfect spacing, the kind of formation that wasn't about riding together, but about being seen, about the deliberate announcement of something that did not require volume to make itself known. She counted 15 before she stopped numbering them and just watched with her eyes. 25, 30, more. The patches were visible even through the heat shimmer, even at distance. A wolf's head stylized angular, with the particular architectural confidence of a symbol that had been designed once and never revised, because there was no need to revise it. Iron Wolves MC. Below it, California. Below that, the bottom rocker she couldn't read yet, but knew without needing to. May had seen the Iron Wolves twice in the 11 years since they had become the dominant 1% club in the California Desert Corridor. Both times had been uneventful. Both times they had come in drunk, their drinks paid their tabs in cash, and left without breaking anything except the quiet. But this was not 2 or 3 riders on their way somewhere else. This was 89 motorcycles pulling off Route 66 into her gravel lot, filling every inch of it, and then lining the shoulder of the road beyond the engines, cutting one by one in a staggered sequence that sounded orchestrated, that sounded like the ending of a piece of music played by instruments that shook the ground. The silence that followed had weight, physical, measurable weight. The tick of hot metal, the crunch of boots on gravel, the low murmur of a large group organizing itself without being told to. May went back behind the bar. She stood up straight. She set her hands flat on the counter and pressed them down slightly the way you anchor yourself when you feel the ground shifting under you, and you need to remind your body that the ground is still there. Hector, she said quietly. He was already folding his newspaper. Yeah, he said. Think I will. He had his jacket on before she finished the thought. She caught the eye of the Las Vegas couple and tilted her head toward the back hallway, the same gesture she had used twice before in 27 years, both times before situations that had not ended well, and both times the people who saw it had understood it and been grateful. They understood it now. They were gone before the front door opened. The truckers didn't move. Truckers never moved. Truckers had seen everything and had a professional obligation to the proposition that they had not. Pete turned a page. The door opened. They came in the way a tide comes in. Not all at once, not in a rush. Steadily from the edges inward filling space with the efficiency of people who have done this in hundreds of bars on hundreds of miles of road and understand how rooms work and how bodies occupy them. The noise level rose and then paradoxically organized itself. It wasn't chaos. Chaos doesn't have that kind of shape. This was occupation total, careful, complete. They were large men, not all of them, but enough of them. Road-worn, leather-heavy, carrying the layered smell of long-distance riding exhaust and sweat and sun-heated leather, and something underneath it all that was older and harder to name, something that the road had deposited in them over so many miles that it had become constituent, that it had stopped being something they carried and started being something they were. They ordered drinks with the directness of people who do not expect to have to repeat themselves. They moved furniture. They claimed space. May poured. She kept her hands steady and her face neutral, and she tracked the room the way she always tracked it, not fixing on any one face, but holding all of them in soft focus at once. The way a good bartender learns to do reading pressure and movement and the subtle atmospheric shifts that precede trouble, the way a person reads weather. She was reading the room like this, holding all of it when the door opened one more time. She knew it immediately, not from anything she could name before the fact. She knew it the way the body knows when the temperature in a room drops, not from a single indicator, but from a shift in the whole atmosphere, something her nervous system registered before her thinking mind caught up to it. The man who came in last was not the largest man in the room. He was not the loudest. There was nothing in his clothing that visually marked him differently from the others. Same leather, same patches, same road dust on the same boots. He was maybe 6'2", broad across the shoulders, with sandy hair going gray at the temples, and a face that had been lived in hard and was not apologizing for it. The face of a man in his middle 40s who had stopped trying to look like his early 30s and found something better on the other side of that. But he moved through that room differently. The others moved for him. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical parting of a crowd in a film, just slightly, just enough. Just the small unconscious adjustments of people maintaining a radius around someone whose presence they can feel without looking at the way you feel a fire, without looking at it the way you know the sun is above you, without raising your eyes. Dax Gallagher. She did not know his name yet. She would learn it in the next hour along with a great deal else. What she knew in the moment he walked through the door was simpler and more immediate. This man was the reason 89 motorcycles had come off Route 66 into her parking lot on a Tuesday in late July. Everything else in the room, every leather jacket and tattooed forearm and cold drink in every calloused hand was context. This man was the sentence. He moved to the bar. He did not sit. He stood with both hands flat on the counter and looked at her with gray-green eyes that were steady and entirely composed, the eyes of a man who had spent a long time keeping everything important behind them and had become expert at it. "Cold beer," he said, "whatever you have on draft." "Coming up," May said. She pulled the tap and watched the glass fill and kept her breathing even. She was very careful not to look at the corner booth. She was very careful not to look at Andrew, because in the 3 seconds since this man walked through the door, she had noticed something she did not yet have words for. Only the instinct that had kept her safe in this bar through 27 years of difficult evenings. This man was scanning the room. Not the way nervous men scan. Not the way aggressive men scan. The way a person scans when they have been looking for something for a very long time and have learned to look like they are not looking. Patient, methodical. The way you go through a room when you have lost something and are retracing your steps, checking everything in sequence, leaving nothing out. She set the beer on the counter. He picked it up, drank, set it down, and his eyes kept moving. Table to table, face to face, not dwelling, not suspicious in any obvious way, just cataloging, just the steady accumulation of a man making sure of what was there and what was not. May moved to the far end of the bar. She picked up her rag. She found something to wipe and she started praying. Not to God exactly, not with words, just that specific, desperate, formless, asking that people do when something is coming, and the coming cannot be stopped, only maybe slightly redirected. She was praying about the afternoon light, which in the ironwood in late July came in through the front window, at an angle that combined with the neon behind the bar, to do things in certain corners of the room at certain hours that were beautiful, if you were in the mood for beauty, and alarming if you were in the mood for caution. The afternoon light did not listen. The jukebox was midway through a slow guitar piece when it happened. The amber and copper of the old Coors sign behind the bar, combined with the flat white gold of the July afternoon coming through the front window, and traveled across the room in the way physics travels, without intention, without mercy. It found the corner booth. It found the silver pendant in Andrew's hands. It hit that small piece of metal at the precise angle required to send a single flash of reflected light off the engraved surface. Not sustained, not dramatic, one pulse barely a second in duration, like a signal, like something winking from a hilltop. May saw at the same moment Dax Gallagher's head turned. Not quickly, not with the sudden snap of a man startled. Slowly, the way a compass needle turns. Because north is not a direction it chooses. It is a direction it cannot help. His eyes found the corner booth, found the boy, found the pendant in the boy's hands. And May watched the color leave his face. She had been tending bar for 27 years. She had watched people receive bad news across this counter, men learning their friends had died, their marriages had ended, their money was gone. She had seen the full range of what hard information does to a human face. She had never seen anything quite like what she saw on Dax Gallagher's face in the moment the light found the pendant. It was not grief, though grief was in it. It was not anger, though anger had been there once, and you could see its architecture still in the set of his jaw. It was not quite recognition, though it was closest to that. It was the expression of a man who has spent 15 years building a wall brick by deliberate brick with tremendous effort and at tremendous cost, and has just watched a crack appear in it that he knows without question is going to bring the whole structure down. He set his beer glass on the bar. He began walking toward the corner booth. The room felt it before it saw it. The noise dropped not all at once, not dramatically, but in sequence, floor by floor, table by table, until what remained was the jukebox, and then May's hand finding the cord, and the jukebox stopping too. The silence that replaced it was not empty. It was full, dense, pressurized the way air feels before a storm makes its decision. 89 men watched Dax Gallagher cross the Ironwood Saloon. Andrew looked up the way children look up when something large is moving toward them before they can see it. Some animal awareness that is older than language and faster than thought. He looked up and he saw the man coming, and he did not run, did not speak, did not do anything except go very still. The particular stillness May had come to recognize in these 3 weeks as his characteristic response to the world. Not passivity, not fear, but the disciplined calm of a child who has been living in the vicinity of adult grief long enough to understand that stillness is often the most useful available action. Dax Gallagher stopped at the edge of the booth. He looked down at the pendant in the boy's hands. The room held. The room had been holding for some time now collectively without knowing exactly what it was holding for. "Where did you get that?" The voice was quiet, completely precisely quiet. The quietest sound in the room by a considerable margin, and somehow for that reason, the only sound that mattered. Andrew's throat moved. His fingers tightened on the pendant once, then held. "My dad gave it to me," he said. His voice was small, but it did not shake. May felt something fierce move through her at that. It did not shake. Dax looked at him steadily. "Your dad? What's his name?" Andrew's eyes moved to May just briefly, the reflex of a child checking with the adult in the room, asking without words whether it was all right to answer. May gave him the smallest nod she could manage while still making sure he saw it. Andrew looked back at the man across from him. "William," he said, "William Armstrong." The silence changed. It had been held breath before. Now it was something else, something that had a sound beneath the soundlessness, a vibration that May felt again in the soles of her feet. This time not from engines. She watched it move through the room, the subtle, collective, unmistakable physical response of a large group of people hearing words they had not expected to hear on an ordinary afternoon, in an ordinary bar in the California desert on an ordinary Tuesday in July. William Armstrong. She did not know that name yet. She would learn it, and quickly, and when she learned it, she would understand that those 2 words had just detonated inside this room with the precision of something that had been buried a long time and had been waiting for exactly the right pressure to set it off. A man pushed off the wall. He was large, larger than Dax Gallagher, with a gray threaded beard and a face that had absorbed enough impact over the decades to have stopped registering surprise, but had never stopped registering grievance. He took 2 steps forward, and his voice came out with the texture of gravel on sheet metal. "Briggs," said Dax without turning around. The big man stopped. "We just letting this go." He didn't raise his voice, but the intention in it was unmistakable. The intention of a man who has been carrying something a long time and recognizes with a body-level animal recognition the scent of the moment when the carrying might be over. "Sit down." That token was on Iron Rex's body when we buried him. Briggs's voice had not risen. If anything, it had dropped, gotten denser the way pressure works when it has nowhere to go but inward. We buried him with it. And now this kid is sitting in a bar in Needles with it in his hands, and you want to just... Spike! The word dropped like a stone into still water. Spike Briggs stopped. He did not sit. But he stopped, and the 2 feet of ground he had claimed in the direction of the booth was the totality of what he was going to claim in this particular conversation. And somewhere in the set of his shoulders, he seemed to know it. Dax turned back to Andrew. "The man behind me," he said, and his voice had the calm directness of someone accustomed to translating dangerous situations into language that a child could hold without being crushed by it, "has been angry for a long time. He is not going to hurt you. But you should understand that what you're holding is connected to something that costs people here a great deal." Andrew looked at him. He was quiet for a moment. "Then you should probably know the truth," he said. The sound that moved through the room then was not a sound exactly. It was more like the room itself taking a breath, a collective, involuntary, uncontrolled inhale. Briggs made a short, sharp sound that was not quite a laugh. Kid thinks he knows the truth. The money, Andrew said. Just those two words. Flat certain. The words of a child who has been sitting with something for months and has finally found the person to say it to. Nobody breathed. The money is still there, Andrew said. And for a long moment in the Ironwood Saloon on a Tuesday in the Mojave summer, nobody moved. Not Dax Gallagher, not Spike Briggs, not the 87 other men arranged along the walls and behind the tables, not the two truckers in the back booth, not Pete, who had finally truly set down his book and placed it on the table with the deliberateness of a man acknowledging that whatever was unfolding in front of him had crossed a threshold that fiction couldn't compete with. Not May, who had stopped wiping the counter and was standing with both hands still at her sides, watching a 10-year-old boy drop something into a room full of men who had been looking for it for 15 years. Briggs was the first one to speak, and the heat had gone out of his voice, and something colder had moved in something that May recognized and did not mistake for anything safer than what it was. "What did you just say?" "I said it's still there," Andrew repeated. "My dad didn't spend it. He didn't take it. He hid it." He looked at Dax, not at Briggs. He kept his eyes on Dax. "That's what the notebook is," he said. "It's directions." Dax looked at the boy for a long moment. Something was happening in his face, some slow interior motion, the dismantling of something that had been built with enormous effort and an enormous expenditure of years, the careful examination of the foundation underneath. May watched it and held very still and did not speak. "Why would you tell us this?" Dax said finally. "Because it doesn't belong to me," Andrew said. He looked at the table for a moment, then back up. "And because my dad wanted me to give it back. He said when the time came, I should find the people it belonged to and give it back. He said it was the only thing he had left that he could do right." Spike Briggs made a sound. May recognized it, the involuntary body-level sound a man makes when the structure his anger has been living in for 15 years shifts without warning. Not crumbling, not yet. Just shifting, just the first crack. Just the wall moving in a way it had not moved before. "He's lying," Briggs said, but his voice did not have the same certainty it had carried 60 seconds ago. His voice had a quality now that May recognized from 27 years of standing behind a bar and listening to people say things they were no longer entirely sure of. "He's a kid. He doesn't know what he's saying." "He sounds like he knows exactly what he's saying," said a voice from near the front of the room. Young, careful. The voice of someone measuring his words before releasing them, not from timidity, but from precision. Several of the men around it gave it room in the way that people give room to voices that have earned weight. Briggs turned his head toward the voice. "Owen, don't. I'm just saying what everyone is thinking." "Nobody is thinking anything," Dax said, "until we know more." He put one hand flat on the table, palm down, a gesture so automatic and apparently so effective that both men were quiet before he turned back to Andrew. "Your father told you about the money?" "Yes." "Told you it was still there?" "He didn't tell me exactly where." Andrew's eyes dropped to the notebook. "That's in here." He looked back up. "He didn't want me to know where in case anyone came looking. He said the only protection he could give me was not knowing." Dax looked at him. "Smart man," he said, and the complexity in those two words was considerable. Not admiration exactly, not grief exactly, not the residue of 15-year-old anger. Something that held all three and had learned to coexist with all three, the way a scar holds the history of a wound and the evidence of the healing both in the same piece of skin. "He was scared," Andrew said. His voice finally cracked just once, just slightly, the way a fault line shows through stone. "Every day. I didn't understand it when I was little. I thought that was just how dads were. That dads looked at doors when they opened. That dads sat with their backs to walls. That dads got up at 3 in the morning and sat alone in the kitchen." He swallowed. "I understood later. He was waiting, not for anything good." The room was absolutely silent. May had stopped breathing at some point in the last few minutes and was not sure exactly when. Dax's eyes were steady on the boy. Steady in the way that very deep water is steady, with everything that matters happening far below the surface, never breaking it. "He was waiting for us," Dax said. "Yes." For 15 years. Yes, a pause that had the weight of a long road in it. He never ran, Dax said, and it was not a question and it was not quite a statement. It was something a man says when he is reassembling everything he thought he knew about another man piece by piece from the beginning. He stayed in Needles, Dax continued. He stayed close. He never changed his name. He counted on you looking, Andrew said. It's in the notebook. He wrote that the only thing keeping him safe was the money, that you needed what he knew about it, and that you needed it enough to not just... Andrew stopped. His voice was controlled again, but the effort was visible. To not just end it. The room absorbed this. At the far end of the bar, Hector was long gone. The Las Vegas couple was long gone. The Ironwood held 89 bikers and 2 truckers and an old man with a closed paperback and May Ford behind her counter and one 10-year-old boy in the corner booth and the particular compressed silence of a room where the thing that has been true all along is making its way to the surface and everyone can feel it coming and nobody is ready. Show me the notebook, Dax said. Andrew shook his head. The room exhaled in surprise. It was the kind of surprise that is almost physical, the collective reaction of a large group simultaneously registering the same unexpected thing. A child had just said no to the most dangerous person in the room. And he had said it without hesitation, without drama, without any apparent awareness of what he was doing. Or May thought watching him with complete awareness, which was a different thing entirely, which was in its own way more astonishing. It's mine, Andrew said. My dad left it to me, not to you. Dax leaned back in the chair. He looked at the boy for a long moment, and May watched the corner of his mouth move. Not a smile, not exactly, but something in that direction, something that had not surfaced in a long time. You have his eyes, Dax said quietly. Andrew did not respond to this. Your father and I, Dax said, and then he stopped. He picked up his beer and drank and set it down and looked at the table for a moment, doing something interior and private that the room understood well enough to leave alone. When he looked back up, his face had reconfigured itself into something more careful. Your father and I knew each other a long time ago. I know, Andrew said. Dax went very still. What do you know? I know you were looking for him. Andrew's hands were flat on the notebook now, both palms down. He told me, not with words, but he kept a photograph in the same place as the notebook. Old. A bunch of men at a long table. He'd written names on the back. He paused. Your name was one of them. The silence shifted again, like something large and slow adjusting its weight. He kept a photograph, Dax said. Yeah, some of you. Dax was very quiet for a moment. Was he happy in that picture? The question landed differently than anything else had landed. Not tactical, not calculated. The genuine, unguarded question of a man who has been angry for so long that he has forgotten what was underneath the anger until this specific moment when it surfaces through the architecture of 15 years without warning, the way water surfaces through rock, through stone, through everything you built to contain it. Andrew thought about it seriously. He gave it the weight it deserved. He looked younger, he said finally, like he didn't know yet. Didn't know whatever it was that made him look the way he looked the week before he died. The first man spoke up from along the wall. Not Briggs, someone else older, quieter, with a stillness that had its own authority. Cruz, 50s. He pushed off the wall and his voice was level and unhurried. Bull. He used Dax's road name the way men use road names when they are in the territory of something important. We letting this go. The kid walks in here with Iron Rex's token, and we're sitting here talking. Dax did not turn around. We're not letting anything go, he said. We're listening, which is something we haven't done in 15 years. Cruz held for a moment, then he subsided. He did not sit, but he subsided. Dax looked back at Andrew. The man behind me, he said, is asking questions I understand. He looked at the table, then back up. I need you to understand something. He leaned forward, elbows on the wood. What you're holding, what your father left you, is connected to something that cost the people in this room a great deal. I'm not telling you that to frighten you. I'm not frightened, Andrew said. May believed him. What she saw on his face was not fearlessness. Fearlessness was a young man's condition, something you had before you understood enough to be afraid. What she saw was something older and harder to come by, the quality of a child who had been afraid of the right things for a long time and had made a kind of peace with it, who had learned to function in the presence of fear the way his father apparently had. "I know," Dax said and looked at the boy. "That's what I mean." Andrew was quiet for a moment. "Then there's a condition." Dax waited. "My aunt stays." Andrew looked toward the bar, toward May, and his face had a quality she had seen before in this booth, but never directed at her, the quality of a child extending the most guarded and carefully managed thing he owned. "May stays. Whatever you find out, she hears it too." "Deal," said Dax. He looked at May. "I hope you have coffee." May was already moving to the machine. "I have coffee," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. From somewhere in the back of the room, the young voice again. "Owen." "That's going to take a while," he said. "Good," May said. "I've got time." She started the coffee, and nobody spoke for a long moment. And outside, the Mojave Desert held the afternoon the way it held everything, without sentiment, without impatience, enormous and permanent and entirely present, having learned long ago that everything that comes into the desert eventually tells the truth, and all that is required of the desert itself is the willingness to wait. The coffee percolated, and the room organized itself in the way that rooms do when something has been decided without being formally decided, everyone finding a position that acknowledged the new terms. Men who had come in ready for confrontation had discovered that confrontation was not what was required, and in its place had found something stranger and less comfortable and more necessary: attention. They arranged themselves around the corner booth in a loose half-circle with the involuntary focused attention of people gathered around something they could not look away from. Two of them quietly moved extra chairs from the storeroom May had indicated with a glance. One brought a second table alongside to accommodate the crowd that had naturally assembled. Pete Calloway had moved his chair 4 feet closer to the booth and was not pretending he hadn't. May poured the first round of coffee into the mug she kept behind the counter, the heavy ceramic ones that had been there since the previous owner, and showed their age in the glaze, and she set them along the end of the bar nearest the booth. A young man, the one called Owen, who had the particular quality of a person doing his best to show everyone that he was paying appropriate attention without being obvious about the fact that he was paying any attention at all, came forward and picked up 2 cups without being asked, and brought one to Dax and set the other in front of Andrew with the careful deliberateness of a man performing a small act that might be the only useful thing available to him. Andrew looked at it and nodded once, the nod of a child who has been raised with manners, and picked it up and held it with both hands the way people hold warm things when they are cold. The room settled. The noise, which had been so total and various when they came in, had been replaced by something its opposite: a listening quiet, a collective attention that had the texture of held breath. Dax opened the notebook. He read the way you approach something dangerous carefully, from a respectful distance, not rushing toward it. His eyes moved down the first page slowly, and his face was composed and gave nothing back. His right hand, the hand not holding the notebook, was flat on the table and pressing down slightly, just slightly, the way you press down on something when you need the solidity of it, when you need to know the table is there. Nobody spoke. The room had reorganized itself from an occupation into something it had not been before and did not entirely have a name for a congregation. Men who had ridden in with one understanding of why they were here were sitting in a bar in Needles, California on a Tuesday afternoon in July, learning that the understanding was wrong and doing the hardest thing any person can do, which is to let a wrong understanding be replaced in real time, in front of witnesses, with whatever the truth turned out to be. Dax read for 4 minutes without pausing, then he stopped. He set the notebook flat on the table, open. "October 3rd, he said. His voice was entirely even, the voice of a man who has learned to speak clearly, precisely, when everything in him is doing anything but. "Your father writes that he counted the money for the 11th time that year, that it was still all there, every dollar. He looked at the table, he counted it every year. I didn't know that," Andrew said. "He writes that he was afraid it would start to feel like his." He looked up. That was his specific fear, that living next to it long enough, he'd begin to think of it as his. He looked at the room, at Cruz, at Briggs, at the men along the walls, who were listening with the focused attention of people who have been carrying the weight of a 15-year-old wrong, and are beginning to feel its shape change in their hands. That is not the journal of a man who stole. Cruz, who had not spoken since he'd subsided, said from his position along the wall, "Read the part about the night. You found it." "I can see it in your face," Cruz said. His voice was quiet and certain. "Read it." Dax looked down at the notebook. He turned pages, and when he found what he was looking for, something in his body changed a slight forward lean, a stillness in the shoulders, the physical posture of a man receiving information that he has been waiting for without knowing he was waiting. He read it through once without speaking, his eyes moving, just his eyes. Then Briggs said from the bar stool, where he had ended up quietly but unmistakably out loud. Dax looked up. He looked at all of them, all the faces, every man. Then he read, November 9th, 15 years today. I need to write it again because I need to make sure I never forget the exact truth of it. Not the version my guilt has shaped, not the version my fear has built. The actual sequence, because Rex deserves to have someone remember it correctly, even if that someone is only me. There were federal agents and informants, 10 of them, not 3, not 5. They had been following the money for months, and the night we were moving was the night they chose to move. Rex knew before I did. He always knew things before I did. He said, "William, take the box, take the bike, ride, do not stop, do not come back." I said I wasn't leaving him. Dax paused. He was looking at the page, but he was somewhere else, somewhere 15 years back and 40 miles east and 22 years old, the same age Owen Roth was sitting in this room right now. "He hit me," Dax read, "hard enough to put me down. And when I got up, he was already standing between me and them. He said, 'This is a direct order. You ride. You hide the money. You keep it safe until the club can take it back clean without federal hands on it. You wait for my son.'" The room was completely silent. May had her hand over her mouth. She did not know when she had put it there. "I rode. I heard the shooting start when I was 50 yards out. I heard it, and I kept riding because he told me to, and because I was following an order, and because I was 22 years old and I was afraid. I have never in 15 years been able to decide which of those three things is most true. I have never stopped trying to decide." Dax set the notebook down. He did not put it face down this time. He left it open. "He was 22, Owen said quietly from across the room. He followed an order," Cruz said. "That's not the same as running." There was a long silence. Then Dax said, "No, it's not the same." He looked at the open notebook. He knew that. I think he knew that and couldn't make himself believe it. Andrew was looking at the table. May watched his face, and she thought, this boy has been living on the edge of this story his whole life. And he is only now hearing the full shape of it, and the full shape is both worse and better than what he already knew. And worse and better is a harder thing to carry than simply worse. "He believed it at the end," Andrew said. He looked up. "The last month before he died, he was different. He'd been far away my whole life somewhere you could see him, but couldn't quite reach. And then the last month he came back. He was there. He looked at me when I talked. He laughed at things. He looked at Dax. I thought it meant he was getting better. Nobody said anything to that. There was nothing adequate to say. He knew he was dying," Dax said quietly. "I think he decided," Andrew said. The words settled in the room the way a heavy thing settles when you set it down carefully with the full weight of it. Decided to come back. To spend the last part of it right. May thought of the paramedic's description. Something between peace and profound relief. She thought of a man who had spent 15 years carrying something no human being was designed to carry, who had at the end found the right way to set it down, and had done so, and who had died in the knowledge that the carrying was finished. She thought about how sometimes relief and grief are exactly the same face. Dax stood up abruptly. Several men straightened reflexively, hands moving old trained response. He looked at the room. He needed air. He did not need to explain it. He walked to the front of the bar and pushed through the door into the July afternoon and was gone. Briggs followed, then Cruz, then Owen. One by one, quietly men drifted toward the door, and outside, not in a rush, not in a crowd, the way people move away from something that needs space, the way people move out of a room after something enormous has been said. May looked at Andrew. Andrew was looking at the empty chair across from him. the chair where Dax Gallagher had been sitting. "You okay?" she said. He thought about it genuinely in the serious way he thought about everything. "I think so." He looked at the door. May looked at the door, too. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. She poured him a glass of orange juice and set it in front of him and let the quiet sit. And outside she could hear them without words, the low register of men processing something hard in the way men do, which is usually to stand close together and talk about nothing that is not the thing and somehow talk about nothing else. When Dax came back 12 minutes later, he looked like a different phase of the same storm, not resolved, not finished, but reoriented the way a storm finds its direction. He walked straight to the booth and sat back down and picked up the notebook. "There's more," he said. "I know," Andrew said, "the last 4 pages. He told me they were there. He said that's where the physical directions were. The words to understand them are in the middle section, but the location itself is at the end." Dax turned to the back. He read, and his face traveled more emotional ground in the next 90 seconds than most faces cover in a month. The controlled compression of a man reading and processing simultaneously, then something tightening, then something releasing, and then an expression. May had no single name for the face of a person who has been punishing 2 people with the same fist for 15 years and has just understood that both the punishment and the crime were built on a foundation that never existed. He looked up. "Anvil Rock," he said. 3 men along the walls reacted visibly to that name. A sharp intake, a head coming up, a hand dropping from where it had been folded. "You know it," Dax said. "Not a question." "That was the rendezvous point," Cruz said. His voice had something rough at the edges now, something old working through the careful surface. "The night it happened. That's where we were supposed to meet him. He never came." "He came," Dax said. "He just couldn't get back to us afterward." "How far?" Briggs said. 40 minutes, maybe 45. The room moved with a sudden collective purposeful motion, men pushing off walls, finishing drinks, or setting them down unfinished, the creak of leather and the jingle of keys. The room reorganizing itself from gathering to departure with the speed and efficiency of a group that has been waiting for a direction and has finally received one. "Wait!" Andrew was standing. He was standing in the booth, notebook in both hands, small and blonde and 10 years old, and he was holding the room. Not with volume, not with authority. With the quality of his stillness, the same quality that had stopped Dax Gallagher at the edge of the booth 45 minutes ago, this child's particular gravity, the weight of someone who has been carrying a heavy thing with complete commitment and has earned without trying to the room's involuntary attention. "I want to come," he said. Dax looked at him. "No. He's my father. Whatever's out there is connected to my father. I brought you here. I kept the notebook." Andrew stopped. His voice was level. "I have a right." Dax was quiet for a moment. "Then I hear you, and I'm telling you no. Not because you haven't earned it." He held the boy's gaze steadily. "Because some things a child should not be the one to find. Things you can know without seeing. The knowing is enough. The seeing stays with you longer than you want it to." Andrew looked at him for a long moment. "Then Will, you come back and tell me whatever it is. Will you tell me everything?" "Yes," Dax said, without hesitation. "I will come back and tell you everything." Something settled in Andrew's face. Not happiness. This was not a happy moment, but the settlement of something finding the right place to rest. He held out the notebook. Dax took it. And then Andrew reached into the front pocket of his jacket and held out something else. Small, silver. The pendant, the one Dax had set on the table earlier, the one Andrew had picked back up so quietly that no one had noticed. "Take this too," Andrew said. His voice was steady, "in case there's a reason to have it there." Dax looked at the pendant resting in the boy's palm. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he picked it up and put it in his breast pocket close to his body, the natural place for something that matters. "Stay with your aunt," he said. "I will." Dax looked at May across the length of the bar, and the look held a whole conversation. A conversation about what he might find and what it might mean, and what he was asking her to hold together in his absence, which was not a building and not a boy, but the specific, fragile, almost arrived moment of a truth that had not yet finished making its way to the surface. "I'll be here," May said. He nodded once. He turned. He walked out. 89 men followed him, and the sound of 89 engines starting was the loudest thing the Ironwood Saloon had heard in a very long time. And then it was fading, moving east into the desert afternoon, and then it was gone. The saloon held an enormous silence. Old Pete cleared his throat. He said to no one in particular, in the voice of a man who has read enough westerns to recognize a third act development when he sees one, "I have had some interesting Tuesdays in my life, but this one is going to be hard to beat." One of the truckers laughed. Short, surprised, the laugh of a man who had decided to sleep through history and had just discovered that history does not honor that kind of decision. May came around the bar and sat down across from Andrew. She didn't say anything. She just sat the way she had sat with Donna when William died, the way you sit with someone, when presence is the only honest thing you have to offer. Andrew was looking at the door. The desert was out there beyond it, enormous and ancient and patient, holding the afternoon, the way it held everything, without preference, without hurry, because the desert had learned long ago that everything comes to it eventually, and all it had to do was be there when it arrived. What if it's not there? Andrew said it quietly, not as a rhetorical question, not as the expression of a fear he wanted dismissed, but as a genuine question offered to the only adult in the room who he trusted to take it seriously and answer it honestly. May looked at him. His hands were flat on the table now, both of them the way Dax Gallagher had pressed his hands flat when he was reading. She thought there was probably something in that, some shared posture of people in the presence of something that requires anchoring. "What do you mean?" she said. "What if my dad was wrong about what he remembered?" He was quiet for a moment. It was a long time ago. 15 years of being afraid and afraid people make mistakes. What if the coordinates got mixed up over time? What if the location changed somehow, or someone else found it, or... He stopped himself. He was careful, May said. "I know he was careful," Andrew said. "But careful people can still be scared, and scared people can still misremember." He was holding himself very still the way he did when something was costing him. He was scared for 15 years, May. And scared people... May said, "Your father counted that money every year." Andrew looked at her. "That's in the notebook. He counted it every year for 15 years. He was still confirming it, still checking. A man who is that afraid, and also that meticulous, and who checks his own work even when it would be easier not to. That is not a man who gets sloppy about the one thing he is protecting. That's not who he was." Andrew was quiet. "He wrote about the desert," he said finally. "Not the part with the coordinates. Earlier. He wrote about how it doesn't change, how he could come back after years, and the same rock was in the same place, and the same roads were the same roads. He said it was the only thing he trusted." He paused, and his voice was careful around what came next. "The way you are careful around something breakable." He said the desert keeps what you put in it. May felt something move through her chest and up into her throat and settle behind her eyes in the way that is close to tears, but is not exactly tears, the way that certain true things land in certain moments. She breathed through it. "Your father was a good man," she said. "I know," Andrew said quietly. "I just needed other people to know it too." They sat with that for a moment. The coffee was still hot. The jukebox was still unplugged. The Ironwood Saloon existed in the particular stillness of a room that has held something enormous and is now in the aftermath of it, in that specific transitional state between the event and the reckoning, between the stone dropped in the water and the last of the ripples reaching the edge. May thought about William Armstrong, who she had known for 12 years as a quiet man, a careful man, a man whose handshake was precise and whose manner at the bar was courteous without being warm. She had never known what the weight was. She had sensed it the way you sense weight without knowing its nature, the way you can tell a person is carrying something without knowing what it is, simply from the way they move and the way they hold themselves and the particular quality of their attention when they think no one is watching. She knew now. She thought about what it would cost a person to carry that for 15 years, to sit at a desk in the spare bedroom of a house in Needles and do other people's accounting, and drive to Barstow 3 times a week, and come home to dinner and tell his son about the ordinary things of an ordinary day. To hold a child's hand at bedtime, knowing what was buried in the desert 40 minutes east. To walk through a grocery store and a hardware store, and a church on Sunday, and a parking lot, and 100 other places where ordinary life assembled itself, knowing that he was one wrong moment, one wrong face, one wrong question away from everything coming apart. She thought about what it cost him to sit with his back to walls in every room he ever entered for 15 years. And she thought about the fact that he had done it anyway, that he had held on and kept counting and kept the faith in the most literal sense, kept the thing that he had been given to keep clean and intact and waiting for the right hands. She thought about Andrew at the funeral pressing the pendant into his fist hard enough to leave a mark. He understood, she thought. Maybe not in words, maybe not with anything he could have articulated then or even now. But in the body and the bones, in the specific way, grief settles into a person he understood. "What time is it?" Andrew said. She checked the clock behind the bar, coming up on 7. Andrew looked at the window. The light outside had shifted from the white gold of afternoon into the particular amber and violet that the desert made in the hour before dark, a color that didn't exist anywhere else that May had ever been, and that she had sometimes thought of as the desert's way of telling you it was paying attention. "They'll be there by now," Andrew said. She thought so too. "He's looking for his father," Andrew said. Not a question. He said it the way he said things he had been sitting with for a while and had finally found the right words for. "Yes," May said. He spent a long time not knowing. Andrew was quiet for a moment. "Like me." He looked at his hands. "I knew my dad was gone, but I didn't know why he looked the way he looked. I didn't know what the weight was. And not knowing is its own kind of not there." May looked at him. She thought he was right about that. She thought he was right in the way that children are sometimes right about fundamental things having come to the truth without the intermediary of the vocabulary that adults accumulate in the course of filling in their understanding and therefore arriving cleaner and more precisely at the thing itself. "Your father loved you," May said. "That I know for certain." Andrew nodded. He looked at the door again. "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "He just couldn't let me know what he was afraid of. He thought keeping me not knowing was the same as keeping me safe." May said. "Was he wrong?" Andrew thought about it. His face was serious in the way she had come to know as his face when he was actually considering something rather than reacting to it. "No," he said at last. "I mean, I wish I'd known, but I understand why he didn't. He was trying to protect me." He paused. "I just wish I could have told him it was okay, that I would have been all right knowing." He looked at the table. "He carried it alone so I wouldn't have to, and now I'll always wish I'd been allowed to carry some of it with him." May did not have an answer for that. Some things don't have answers. They have witnesses, and the witness is the only honest offering. She stayed there across the table from him in the amber light, and she witnessed, and she did not look away. The desert was full dark by the time the vibration returned. May had been expecting it, and still it took her a moment to be sure, the way you can expect something completely and still have to verify it when it arrives. She felt it first in the floor, the same low frequency as before the bone-level announcement of engines. And she looked at Andrew, and he was already sitting up straighter. His face changed, lifted the alert attentiveness of a child who has been waiting and has just heard the signal he was waiting for. "It's different this time," he said. May knew. The difference was in the character of the sound itself, not the sound of arrival, not the organized, deliberate sound of something making itself known. The sound of return. There is a distinction the body knows between the two, even when the volume is the same, even when the distance is the same. Arrival has a forward pressure to it. Return has weight. These engines had weight. Old Pete had put his book in his jacket pocket. The two truckers, who had indeed been asleep against the wall for the better part of an hour, had stirred and were blinking in the way of men reassembling themselves and trying to determine how much dignity had been lost in the process and whether there was anything to be done about it. The engines grew and then cut one by one in the same sequence as before, the staggered progression from front to back. But the silence that followed was different. The silence before had been coiled, waiting charged with the tension of something that hasn't decided yet. This silence was the silence of men who have been somewhere and come back carrying what they found there. And what they found there was heavy and real and permanent, and would take a long time to integrate into the ordinary fabric of days. The door opened. Dax Gallagher walked in. Andrew looked at his face, and May watched it happen. The boy reading the man's face, the way he had been reading his father's face his whole life. The specific skill of a child who grew up in the presence of something that couldn't be said directly and learned to read the world beneath the surface of what was said. He read Dax's face and he knew. Not the details, not yet. But the essential truth of it, the most important fact, was written in the specific quality of Dax Gallagher's exhaustion, which was the exhaustion of a man who has finished something that needed finishing. Not defeat, completion. Dax walked to the booth. He sat down. He put William's notebook on the table between them. He put the pendant beside the notebook. Andrew looked at both of them, then at Dax. "Tell me," he said. Dax told him. He did it carefully. Not quickly, not with the unburdening rush of a man releasing something long compressed. Carefully in sequence, the way you tell a 10-year-old boy something that will change the story he tells himself about his father, which is also the story he tells himself about himself. He placed each piece of it with the same methodical attention that William Armstrong had brought to a ledger, checking that each element was properly positioned before moving to the next, making sure the weight was distributed correctly before adding more. "The lockbox," he said, 50 yards northeast of the shelf at Anvil Rock, 40 feet from the base. He paused. It was there. Andrew's face did not change much. He had already believed it. But belief and confirmation are not the same thing. And the confirmation of it, the word "there," said quietly in a bar in Needles on a July evening, moved through the room and landed differently than any similar statement would have landed in any other context. $500,000, Dax said. Every dollar intact, wrapped in heavy plastic sheeting sealed against the desert. The packaging was deliberate and meticulous. It was the work of a man who did not know how long the keeping would last and who was accounting for every possible duration. He did it the way he did everything, Andrew said quietly. "Yes," Dax said, "exactly that." He paused. He looked at the table. "There's more," he said. The notebook had a final entry I didn't read aloud in the bar. I kept it back because I needed to see it first before I could say it, before it could be real. Andrew waited. "Your father went back," Dax said. Andrew looked at him. "The night it happened, after he hid the money, after he did what my father ordered him to do. He went back to Anvil Rock." May watched Andrew's face. "He found my father." Dax's voice was even and careful, and it cost him something to keep it that way, and the cost was visible in the small, precise tension around his eyes. He brought him in from the open. He buried him properly with his patch, with his colors, the way a man like that deserved to be buried. He marked the place. He stopped. He did it alone, in the dark. He never told anyone because there was no one to tell. He went back alone, and he did the only right thing that was still available to him, and he never said a word about it to anyone for 15 years. The room held the silence of something enormous being confirmed. "He never said," Andrew said. His voice was controlled, and the control was visibly, quietly, monumentally effortful. "It's in the final entry," Dax said. "He writes that telling anyone would have meant explaining everything. And explaining everything would have meant your mother knowing. And you knowing." He stopped. "He chose to carry it alone so you and your mother didn't have to." Andrew looked at the table. He was very still. "That's why," he said. To himself as much as to anyone. That's what it was. He looked up. That's what he was carrying. Not just the money, not just the orders. He was carrying someone. "He was carrying two people," May said gently. "Your father's body and your peace of mind." Andrew looked at her. His face did something then, a controlled release of a pressure that had been building since February. Building probably before February building, since the day he was old enough to understand that his father looked at doors when they opened and sat with his back to walls and woke at 3 in the morning to sit alone in the kitchen with something he wouldn't name. The tears came without sound. Not a collapse, not a performance of grief, just the honest and finally allowed physical response of a child who has been too careful too long and has been briefly, mercifully given permission to stop. May slid out of her side of the booth and sat beside him without asking. The way you do when asking would be a kind of formality that the moment didn't have room for. She put her arm around his shoulders. He leaned into it just slightly, just enough the lean of someone who has been holding themselves upright by pure will and has found something solid enough to give them a few seconds of not having to. Dax watched this. He watched Andrew lean into May's arm, and something moved through his face that had not been there before this night. Something he did not manage and did not try to manage. Something that had been in storage for a very long time, in the place where a man keeps the things he can't afford to look at. Behind him, the bar had been filling quietly. Men finding the coffee. Men finding places to sit. Men in the particular state of aftermath, still inside the event, not ready to separate from it, and return to individual, ordinary life, needing to be in the same room with the people who had been there for a little while longer. The atmosphere had changed completely from the charged territorial occupation of 2 hours ago. It was something else now, something that did not have a precise name, but that May recognized from her years of holding this space, the atmosphere of a gathering of people who have been through something together and know it, who are carrying the knowledge of it carefully, who need the weight of it to be collectively held before any one of them can take their portion and go. Spike Briggs came to the booth. He did not sit. He stood at the end of it, big hands at his sides, looking at Andrew with a face that had been stripped of its defenses in the last 2 hours and had not yet rebuilt them and was not, May thought, going to rebuild them tonight. Kid. Andrew looked up, his face still wet. He made no move to wipe it, and May thought that was his father in him, the willingness to let a real thing be a real thing. I've been angry at your father for 15 years, Briggs said. His voice was rough, the way weathered wood is rough, not hostile, just bearing the marks of long exposure to the elements. I need you to know, I need to say it out loud. I was wrong, and that wrong cost your father 15 years of living like a man with a target on him. He swallowed. I can't give that back, but you deserve to hear someone say it. Andrew looked at him. He wasn't angry at you, he said. He wrote about people from before. He never used names, but he wrote about them like he missed them. Like missing them was one of the punishments he'd accepted and was living with. He paused. He wrote about someone who could fix any engine put in front of him. Someone who could tell if food had turned before he tasted it. He said there was a man who laughed like he was surprised every time. He looked at Briggs. Was that you, the laughing? Briggs stared at him. For a long moment, the big man said nothing. Then something moved through his face that May had no name for, except true something that had been compressed under a long winter of wrong belief and was now slowly in the warmth of something finally right beginning to surface. No, Briggs said. His voice had changed again, not rough anymore, something quieter underneath the roughness now. That was Reyes, Tommy Reyes. He paused. Tommy died in 2014. I'm sorry, Andrew said. He meant it. May could hear the sincerity of it, a 10-year-old boy offering condolences to a grieving biker for the loss of a man he had only heard about in nameless stories told in the dark of a small house in Needles. Briggs looked at the ceiling. He breathed through his nose. The breath of a man doing structural maintenance on himself in real time in front of witnesses not trying to hide it. Hell of a thing, he said to the ceiling. Then he looked back at Andrew. Hell of a thing to find out from his kid. Better than not finding out, Andrew said. Briggs looked at him, and then he laughed. It was the same short, sharp, involuntary laugh May had heard from him once earlier in the evening, the laugh of a man ambushed by something he hadn't been prepared for. But it was real. It was completely and entirely real. The laugh of a man who has been carrying a wrong for 15 years and has just discovered that the person most entitled to judge him has chosen without drama and without deliberation to offer mercy instead. Yeah, Briggs said, better than not finding out. He stood there for another moment looking at Andrew, and then he put one of his big hands briefly on the edge of the table, not touching the boy, just touching the table, just the small physical acknowledgement of proximity and something unnameable. Then he stepped back and found a place along the wall. Owen Roth came to the counter and poured himself coffee and stood with it in both hands, the way Andrew had stood with his orange juice and looked at the boy in the booth. Can I ask you something? Andrew nodded. The pendant, how long did you carry it? Since February, Andrew said. Since the day he died. My mom wanted to put it in the casket and I kept it. He paused. I don't know exactly why. It just felt like it wasn't supposed to go into the ground. Like it had somewhere to go that wasn't underground. Owen looked at the pendant on the table, then at Dax, then back at Andrew. Where did you think it was going? Andrew was quiet for a moment. I thought I'd know when I got there, he said. I thought if I kept it long enough, it would show me. The room was quiet in the listening way it had been quiet for the last 2 hours. The specific attention of people who are hearing something that they know will matter long after this night. Dax picked up the pendant. He held it in both hands, turning it over, looking at the engraving. His father's words. His father's faith pressed into silver by a man who had learned in a federal prison that the road was longer than any particular stretch of it, and that what kept you going was not the destination, but the holding on. He had carried this pendant since he was 19 years old, and his father had put it in his hand and said, "This is the club's promise to itself, don't lose it." He had watched his father buried with it. He had placed it in the ground with his own hands. He looked at Andrew. "This belongs in the club," he said. "My father made it for the club, but you carried it here. You brought it back." He looked at the pendant in his palm. "That means something." He set it on the table in the center, equidistant between them. "What do you want to do with it?" The room understood that this was the moment. May felt it. The shift in the atmosphere that occurs when something moves from the process of arriving to the instant of arrival itself. The collective attention of the room focused to a single point with the particular quality of a room that knows it is present for something that will not happen again. Andrew looked at the pendant. He was quiet for 10 seconds, 15, and no one in the room moved. Then he picked it up. He held it in his closed fist the way he had held it at his father's funeral, the way a person holds something when they are asking it to be sufficient, when they need it to hold more than metal can hold, and trusting it anyway. His eyes closed. He held it for 10 seconds, 20. Then his eyes opened. He held the pendant out to Dax. "My dad kept it safe," Andrew said, "for 15 years. For your family." He held Dax's gaze with those eyes that were tired in the particular way of someone who has been carrying more than their years contained, but which had something new in them. Now some quality May had been watching develop over the course of the evening, the quality of a window after rain. "We're even." The words settled in the room. Even. The accounting precision of it. The finality. A child closing a ledger that two families had been bleeding into for 15 years, with the same clean-handed care his father had brought to every account he had ever balanced. Dax took the pendant. He closed his hand around it. He stood up. He stood there for a moment looking down at Andrew in the booth, and the room held the quality of its silence, not tense, not waiting, not the breath-held silence of something that hasn't happened yet, the full silence of something complete. Then Dax did something that no one in the room had seen him do. Not Spike Briggs, who had ridden beside him for 20 years. Not Cruz, who had known him since he was 19. Not Owen, who had studied him the way young men study the people they are trying to become. He reached down and put his hand on Andrew's head, not awkwardly, not with the performed tenderness of a man unused to it pretending to a skill he doesn't have. Gently. The way you put a hand on someone when presence is the only adequate instrument and words are not up to the task, when the only thing that will do is the simple, undeniable physical fact of being there. "Your father was not a thief," he said. His voice was quiet and certain, and it was the most important sentence spoken in the Ironwood Saloon in 27 years of sentences. He was not a coward. He was not a traitor. He paused. He was the only man who followed an order all the way to the end, at the cost of everything. And he did it right, and he kept it right for 15 years alone in the dark, and nobody knew. Another pause. "That is who your father was." Andrew sat very still under the weight of that hand, receiving those words the way you receive something you have needed for longer than you knew. Something in his posture, some last tension, some final residual held quality, the physical accumulation of months of caring released. Not all at once, slowly, the way a fist opens. "I know," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I just needed you to know it too." Dax took his hand away. He straightened. He looked at the room, all of it, every man, every face, and he nodded once. The nod that in the language of this particular group meant, "This is what happened here, and we carry it correctly from this night forward, and we are not the same people we were this morning." He walked to the door. At the door he stopped. He looked back at May. "The coffee was good," he said. May looked at him across the length of the bar, across the heads of 89 men and one boy, who had collectively dismantled 15 years of wrong and built something true in its place in the space of one extraordinary evening. "Come back sometime," she said, "when it's not an emergency." The corner of his mouth moved. Then he was through the door. The others followed, filing out in the quiet, sequential way they had entered, except entirely different now. Not occupation departure, the movement of men carrying something new and still learning the shape of it, still deciding how to hold it. Briggs stopped at this booth on his way out. He put something on the table in front of Andrew, a piece of paper folded once with a phone number on it in careful block handwriting. "For your mom," he said, "if she ever needs anything." He looked at Andrew. "We owe your family more than a piece of paper, but it's a start." He walked out. Owen was last. He stopped at the door and turned back. "Hey," he said. Andrew looked at him. "When you're old enough." Owen started, and then he stopped, and then he reconsidered, and then he smiled the genuine, unguarded smile of a young man who has just learned something that reorganized him from the inside out and is still feeling the shape of the reorganization. "Never mind," he looked at Andrew. "You're already old enough. You were old enough tonight." Then he was gone. The engine started, the column formed, and when it moved back onto Route 66, it moved differently than it had arrived. Not the tight, disciplined precision of the approach, the looser human movement of departure of men carrying something new and still figuring out how to hold it, still integrating what the night had given them into the story they would tell about themselves and the people they had been and the people they were now. The sound faded, east and then northeast toward the desert, toward the dark. The Ironwood Saloon held its silence. One of the truckers stirred and rubbed his face and said to nobody in particular, "Somebody want to tell me what just happened?" Pete said without looking up from the table where his closed book sat, justice more or less. He picked up his coffee cup and found it cold and set it back down philosophically. "Took a while to get here. Usually does." May looked at Andrew in the booth. He was looking at the door. His face was dry now, and the quality it held was something she had been watching develop over the course of the night. Not peace exactly. Peace was too simple, too finished a word for what she saw. Clarity, maybe. The clarity of a window after rain. The clarity of a story that has found its ending. He had the notebook in his hands, just holding it, not reading it, feeling the physical fact of it, his father's handwriting, his father's careful thoughts, his father's 15-year account of a loyalty so complete that from the outside it had been indistinguishable from betrayal. He looked at it for a long time, then he looked at May. "I'm going to tell my mom," he said. "All of it." He was quiet for a moment. She always knew he wasn't bad. She just couldn't prove it. He looked at the notebook. Now she can. Now she can, May agreed. Andrew looked at the window. The desert outside was full dark now, the particular darkness of a place very far from city light, where the sky has depth and the stars have layers, and the universe shows its actual scale. The darkness of a place that has been holding its own counsel since long before any of the people standing in it were born and will go on holding it long after. He talked about the desert in the notebook, Andrew said, not the part with the coordinates. He wrote about how the desert doesn't change, how he could be gone for years and come back, and the same rock was in the same place. He said it was the only thing he trusted. He paused. He said the desert keeps what you put in it. May had heard this before. She had said a version of it herself, had been saying it for years without fully understanding it. Now she understood it differently, not as a philosophical observation, not as the particular wisdom of the desert landscape, but as the testimony of a man who had entrusted the most important thing he had to the most reliable keeper he could find, who had put his faith in the ground itself and trusted it to hold until the right hands arrived. The right hands had arrived. The ground had held. She reached across the table and put her hand over Andrew's. He turned his hand over and held on. And in the corner booth of the Ironwood Saloon, where he had sat every afternoon for 3 weeks, holding his father's pendant and waiting without knowing what he was waiting for, Andrew Ford held his aunt's hand and watched the dark desert outside the window and breathed. The waiting was over. The truth had come home. It had done what truth does when you give it enough time and enough space. It had found its way out of the dark and into the light and into the hands of the people who had been holding out for it longest. Outside the Mojave was enormous, impatient, and faithfully dark, holding everything it had ever been given, keeping its promises in the only way the desert knows how, which is silently without ceremony, without recognition, but absolutely and without exception for as long as it takes. May did not let go of the boy's hand. She was still there when the desert began very slowly at the far edge of the horizon, where the land met the sky to lighten. The first hour of waiting had its own quality distinct from what came after. Andrew sat across from her, and they talked in the way people talk when they are both aware that something large is happening elsewhere, and that the waiting is all they have when conversation is less about the exchange of information and more about the maintenance of presence. The simple reassurance of being in the same room with another person who knows what you know and is carrying what you are carrying. He told her about the notebook, not the content of it, the content she had already heard in part from Dax's reading of the specific entries. The experience of reading it. He said he had read the whole thing in a single sitting the night after the funeral in his bedroom with a flashlight while his mother slept, and that it had taken him 4 hours because he kept stopping and starting and having to put it down and then pick it up again. He said it was the first time he'd ever heard his father's voice. May looked at him. His voice he'd heard his father speak his whole life. I know, Andrew said, but there is a difference between hearing what someone says and hearing what they're thinking. He looked at the table. At the dinner table, he talked about the weather and the news and whether the truck needed an oil change. He asked about school. He said the right things in the right order. He paused. But in the notebook he was thinking. He wasn't performing being okay. He was just there. He said it the way a child says a true thing they have found after a long search. I heard him for the first time. May thought about that. She thought about all the ways a person could be present in a room and still unreachable, all the ways that love and fear and necessity could coexist in a person in such constant tension that the love became expressed primarily through the maintenance of the fear's invisibility, through the construction of an ordinary life that served as a container for something that was anything but ordinary, and how a child growing up inside that ordinary life might sense what was underneath it without ever being able to name it or reach through to it. She thought William Armstrong loved his son very much, and the specific form that love took was 15 years of not letting the son carry what the father carried. The specific form of it was a controlled, careful, ordinary life maintained at tremendous cost so that Andrew could have the experience of an ordinary childhood. She thought he succeeded and it cost him everything, and Andrew was right that it was worth it and right that it wasn't fair, and both of those things were true simultaneously, and neither one canceled the other out. Did you tell your mom, May said, about the notebook? Andrew shook his head. I didn't know how. He paused. I didn't know what it meant yet. I thought I needed to understand it before I could explain it. But I didn't understand it. I just had it. Until tonight, May said. Until tonight, Andrew said. They sat with that for a moment. Outside the window, the desert dark was complete and permanent looking in the way of places very far from city lights, where darkness is not the absence of something, but the presence of itself, a substance with its own weight and color and depth. The second hour of waiting was different. Andrew had gone quiet in a way that was not worried and not sad, but was the specific quiet of someone who has done what they set out to do and is now waiting for the result, who has put the thing in motion and has nothing left to do but trust the motion. He had his sketchbook out, the one she had watched him fill every afternoon for 3 weeks, and he was drawing in it with the concentrated absorption she recognized as his purest form of being present, which was also his father's most characteristic posture. Head down focused, doing the work. She watched him draw and thought about the 11 years she had known Dana Armstrong and the 12 years she had served William his coffee when he came in on Saturday mornings, and the 3 weeks she had made sure Andrew's booth was ready every afternoon. She thought about how the ordinary texture of a life could conceal inside it something this large, this consequential, this alive. She poured herself coffee. She drank it standing behind the bar as she had been standing behind bars for 27 years, watching rooms the way only people who have tended them for a long time Learn to watch them with the peripheral attention of someone who is everywhere at once and nowhere in particular present in the whole room simultaneously. She thought about what Dax Gallagher was doing 40 minutes east of this bar. She thought about a 22-year-old man on a motorcycle in the dark with a direct order and the sound of shooting behind him and the choice that had defined the rest of his life. She thought about whether any of us can know in the moment of a choice like that what we are choosing, whether the full weight of the choice can be understood at the time, or whether it can only be understood in retrospect. From the far end of the road it opened, looking back at the moment you made the turn. She thought William Armstrong made the only choice he could make in that moment and spent 15 years trying to decide whether it had been the right one. And she thought maybe the answer to that question is not yes or no. Maybe the answer is it was the only one, and it led to this night, and this night is what it led to. And somewhere in that chain of consequence, there is a kind of rightness that doesn't require the original moment to have been good. She thought about this pendant. Keep the faith. The road survives its kings. She had not been a religious woman for 20 years, and she was not thinking religiously now. But she was thinking about faith in the specific, limited, secular sense of the word, the act of holding on to something. When the evidence suggests you should let go, the act of trusting the ground to hold what you put in it, the act of continuing to do the right thing in the dark when no one is watching and no one will know, and the only witness is the desert itself. William Armstrong had kept the faith, not perfectly, not without cost, with tremendous cost, with his whole life as the cost, with 15 years of solitary carrying as the cost, with the expression on his face that the paramedics described as something between peace and profound relief as the cost, which was also the payment. He had kept it right to the end. May wiped the counter. She topped off Pete's coffee, and Pete thanked her without looking up from his book, which he had reopened to a page about halfway through, though May suspected he had read and reread the same 3 pages for the last hour without registering them. She refreshed the carafe and set it within reach of the spot along the wall where the remaining men who had stayed were sitting, 3 of them quietly, not talking much, in the specific aftermath posture of men who have been somewhere real together and are still inside the closeness of it. She thought about what it would mean to Dax Gallagher to find what she believed he was going to find. She thought about a boy who had grown up in a club that was his father's life's work, who had at 22 years old watched his father be taken from him in circumstances that, because of the secrecy of the life they lived, had no proper accounting, no proper memorial, no proper grave. Who had spent 15 years carrying the weight of a loss that couldn't be spoken of in public, and a betrayal that had shaped the rage that shaped the club, that shaped everything. And then he had walked into a bar in Needles on a Tuesday afternoon, and a 10-year-old boy had been sitting in the corner booth with his dead father's notebook and his dead grandfather's pendant. The desert doesn't let you hide, it just waits. She had been saying that for years without fully believing in the symmetry of it. She believed in it now. At some point past 9 o'clock, Andrew put his sketchbook away and folded his arms on the table and put his head down on his arms, the way children sleep, when sleep takes them by surprise in public places without planning or ceremony. May watched him breathe for a moment, the slow, deep breathing of a child truly asleep, and she thought, this is the first time he has slept like that since February. This is what it looks like when the weight is lifted, even partially, even temporarily. This is what a child looks like when the thing he has been carrying is finally in other hands. She let him sleep. She was standing at the window looking out at the Route 66 darkness when she felt it again. The vibration, low and distant and unmistakable, coming up through the concrete floor, the way it had come up through the concrete floor at the beginning of this long Tuesday. She felt it in her soles, and then she heard it, and she stood at the window and watched the lights appear at the far end of the road, the headlights of 89 motorcycles moving west through the desert dark. They were coming back. She did not wake Andrew until the engines were close enough that the sound would wake him on its own, and they did, and he lifted his head from his arms with the immediate full awareness of a child who has been lightly sleeping on the edge of expectation. He sat up. He listened. It's different this time, he said. She knew. She had known the moment she heard it the difference between arrival and return, the weight of men who have been somewhere and are carrying what they found there back to where they began. The sound of completion. She went behind the bar. She stood up straight. She pressed her hands flat on the counter just slightly, just for the anchor. And she thought, whatever they found, whatever is about to come through that door, this room is where it comes to. This room is where the truth arrives. She had been tending this bar for 27 years, and she had always known in some part of herself she hadn't put words to until now that places absorb what happens in them, that a room that has held enough truth over enough time becomes a kind of container for it, becomes the kind of place that truth recognizes and gravitates toward. The Ironwood Saloon had held 27 years of truth, some of it small, some of it large. Tonight it had held the largest. The door opened, and Dax Gallagher walked in. May looked at his face, and she knew everything before he said a word. She knew it the way she had known at 26 that her marriage was over before she said it out loud. The way she had known at 51 that her doctor's face when he came back into the examination room was a different kind of face than the one he'd had when he went out. The way a person who has spent enough time watching human faces learns to read, not what the face is showing, but what it is holding. Not what the words say, but what the silence underneath them contains. Dax Gallagher had found what he went to find. Andrew was awake and watching, and he read it too, the way he had been reading faces his whole life. And he sat up straighter in the booth and he waited. Dax walked to the booth. He sat down. He put the notebook on the table. He put the pendant beside the notebook. Andrew looked at both of them, then at Dax. "Tell me," he said, and Dax told him. He did it carefully. Not quickly, not with the unburdening rush of a man releasing something long held. In sequence. With the methodical placement of a man who understood or had learned in the last 2 hours to understand what it meant to tell a child something that would change the story the child told himself about his father, which was also the story the child told himself about himself, which was also therefore the story the child would tell the world for the rest of his life. So he was careful. He placed each piece of it the way William Armstrong had placed numbers in a ledger, with full attention, with the understanding that the sequence mattered and the weight distribution mattered, and that a mistake made out of impatience was harder to correct than a deliberate pace was slow. "The lockbox," he said, 50 yards northeast of the shelf at Anvil Rock, 40 feet from the base. Military-grade container sealed against weather and time. He paused, and something in the pause had the quality of a man setting something down he has carried a long way. It was there. Every dollar. Every single dollar intact. "He wrapped it in heavy plastic," Andrew said quietly. "He was careful about it." "He was meticulous," Dax said. "The packaging was the work of a man who didn't know how long the keeping would last, and so had accounted for every duration." He nodded. "That was your father. That was exactly your father." He was quiet for a moment. Then he told Andrew about the ride. He told it the way he had experienced it at the front of a column of 89 men, pushing the pace harder than was strictly safe on an unlit highway, with the pendant against his chest and the notebook in his inside pocket. Both of them present every mile of the 40 minutes, their weight distinct and real, in the way of things that carry more than their physical mass. He told Andrew about the desert dark on either side of the road, the stars out in the numbers you only see that far from a city, so many of them that the sky had depth layers, the universe showing its actual scale. He told him about the turnoff for Anvil Rock, the 2 miles of dirt access road, the gravel spraying when he took the corner without slowing down enough, 89 bikes behind him in the dust. He told him about the moment he cut the engine in the silence that came. And then he told Andrew about the walk to the northeast face. He had known where he was going, he said. His father had brought him to Anvil Rock for the first time when Dax was 17 years old, had walked him out to the northeast face, to the natural shelf where the rock created an overhang that shed water and kept the ground beneath it dry, had said, "Remember this," and then said nothing more, no explanation, no context. Dax had been 17 and had not understood why. He understood now. His father had been a man who spent 22 years as president of a club that made enemies with patience and who had built contingencies so instinctively that some of them he had never explained even to his own son, trusting instead that the son would become the man who would one day understand them. Trusting the son the way William Armstrong had trusted the desert, not with expectation, not with certainty, but with the patient faith of someone who has learned that the right person in the right moment will eventually find each other if the keeping is faithful enough. He had shown a 17-year-old boy a specific place in the desert and trusted that the boy would one day need to know it. 27 years later, the boy was standing at that place with a shovel in the dark. Dax told Andrew how he had put the blade of the spade into the ground and how the first shovel of dirt had come up and then the second, and how he had dug alone for 8 minutes before Spike Briggs stepped in beside him without asking, and how no one had spoken during the digging, because the digging was the speaking, because sometimes the only true language is the work itself. He told him about the sound Briggs's spade made when it hit the lockbox. Dull and flat and slightly hollow, the sound of metal on metal, the sound of something built to hold a thing for a long time and having held it. He told Andrew how he cleared the dirt from the lid with both hands, how he lifted the box out of the ground and worked the lock mechanism, which was stiff with desert and years, but gave after 3 attempts, and how he opened the lid and saw the money exactly as it had been placed there, exactly as William Armstrong had described it. Every dollar intact, a meticulous man's last meticulous act, preserved in the most faithful keeping available to a man with nowhere else to put it. He told him all of that, and then he was quiet for a moment before he told him the rest. He told Andrew about the flat stone, 18 inches to the left of the lockbox. He had seen it when he crouched down to clear the dirt from the lid. He had registered it the way you register things that speak to the part of you that lives below thought, in the quick animal body that knows certain things before the mind has assembled the words for them. He had understood it and had not been ready to say so. And so he had opened the lockbox first, confirmed the money, first done the accountable, measurable thing first, because it was the thing he had language for. And then he had stood up and taken one step to the left and looked at the flat stone and said to the 89 men standing in the desert dark behind him, "Dig here." Owen Roth was the one who did it. Nobody assigned it. It simply fell to him the way certain things fall to the right person in the presence of a group that understands without discussion who should do what. Owen was the youngest, the one who had inherited the mythology of Iron Rex Gallagher without the living memory of it. And so it was Owen who moved through the last barrier between the legend and the reality, whose hands confirmed what everyone else had been carrying for too long, as wound and rage and wrong belief. Owen worked carefully, deliberately, the way a person approaches something they understand must be approached that way. 2 feet down, he stopped. He sat back on his heels and looked up at Dax, and the look on his face said everything there was to say before language could be assembled for it. Dax told Andrew what they found. He told it plainly with the care that plain telling requires when the subject is this heavy canvas and leather-weathered, but held 15 years of desert and everything that 15 years in the ground does to the things placed in it, and through all of it, through every indignity of time, the Iron Wolves patch was still legible. Rex Gallagher's colors were intact. William Armstrong had wrapped him carefully, had placed him in the ground with his colors in the way a man deserved to be placed when the people who should have been there to do it could not be, had marked the place with a flat stone, and had protected the location for 15 years with the simplest possible means, being the only person who knew. Dax told Andrew what he did when Owen looked up at him from the ground. He crouched beside the place and put his hand on the canvas, just resting it there, not moving anything. The way you put a hand on a shoulder when words are the wrong instrument and presence is the only adequate offering. He said his father's name. Just once, just the name. In the way you say the name of someone whose absence has been present for so long, it has become its own kind of company, its own persistent thing you carry. He sat there for a while, he said, in the desert dark with 89 men standing in a circle, with their lights pointing inward, and nobody spoke. Because the speaking had already been done. Because 15 years had been one long statement leading to this moment, and the moment itself required only the willingness to be present in it. Before they left, he had taken the pendant from his pocket and placed it on the flat stone. He had said the inscription. His father's words, "Keep the faith. The road survives its kings," coming home to the man who had made them, who had pressed them into silver in a federal prison because he believed them, who had given them to the men he trusted absolutely because he meant them. He looked at Andrew when he finished. "The road survives its kings," he said again, "because of men like your father." The room was listening, not with the held breath tension of earlier in the evening, but with the different quality of people who are present for a telling that matters, who understand they are receiving something that they will carry for the rest of their lives, that tonight will be part of who they are from here forward. Dax was quiet for a moment, and the quality of his quiet change became more careful, became the specific quiet of a man approaching the part of a story that is hardest to tell, not because it is worst, but because it contains the most. "There's more," he said, "in the notebook. A final entry I kept back." He looked at Andrew steadily. "I kept it back because I needed to see it first with my own eyes before I could say it out loud. Before it could be real the way spoken things are real." Andrew waited. "Your father went back," Dax said. Andrew's breath changed. May, standing 3 feet away at the end of the counter, heard it, the small involuntary intake of a person whose body understood something before the mind had finished processing the words. "The night it happened," Dax said, "after he hid the money, after he did what my father ordered him to do, he went back. He waited. He found my father. He brought him in from the open. He buried him properly, with his patch, with his colors, with the respect that a man like that deserved. He marked the place with a flat stone." Dax stopped. "He did it alone," he said, "in the dark. He went back alone and he did the last right thing that was available to him. And he never told anyone, because there was no one to tell. Because telling anyone would have meant explaining everything, and explaining everything meant your mother knowing and you knowing, and he chose for 15 years to carry it alone so that you didn't have to." Andrew was looking at the table. He was very still. "He was carrying him," Andrew said, "to himself quietly, not really directed at anyone. That's what it was. That's what he was carrying. Not just the money and the orders and the fear. He was carrying someone. He was taking care of someone." His voice was even, but the evenness was costing him. He looked up. "He spent my whole life taking care of your father's body and nobody knew." Andrew said, "Not your people, not my mom, not me." Dax met his eyes. He held them. "Nobody knew," Dax said. "Yes. There are things that arrive in a room not as sound or movement or any physical event, but purely as weight, as the particular density of something true that has finally found the air, and this was one of those things." May felt it against her chest, in the back of her throat, in the precise place behind her sternum, where she had learned over 27 years of standing behind bars that the most important moments announce themselves. "That's why he looked the way he looked," Andrew said. He said it quietly with the finality of something that has been understood. "I thought it was just the fear of being found, the fear of what would happen if the wrong people came. But it wasn't only that. He was carrying a man. He was carrying your father, in the knowledge of where he was and the weight of being the only one who knew." He stopped. "And he never complained," Andrew said. "He never acted like it was too much. He just carried it." Spike Briggs made a sound from along the wall. Not a word. Something that came from below language, the involuntary sound of a man who has been wrong about something important for a long time and has just had the fullness of the wrongness confirmed in a way that goes past the intellectual understanding of it and into the body, into the bones, into the place where guilt lives when it has nowhere else to go. Dax looked at the table. He looked at the open notebook. He looked at William Armstrong's handwriting, which was a small, careful, precise handwriting, the handwriting of a man who understood that the words mattered and that the care taken with them was a form of respect. He wasn't alone out there, Dax said. He was never alone. He just couldn't let anyone see the company he was keeping. May thought about that. She thought about William Armstrong in the kitchen of the house in Needles at 3 in the morning, sitting with a cup of coffee that went cold, keeping company with a dead man, the way you keep company with the dead when you are the only one who knows where they are, and the only thing you can give them is the knowledge that someone remembers. "That's loyalty," she said. She hadn't meant to say it out loud, But the room was quiet enough that it carried, and Dax looked at her and the men along the walls looked at her, and nobody disagreed. That's the oldest kind of loyalty, Pete said from his corner. His voice was quiet and certain, the voice of a man who had read enough stories about the desert and the people who lived in it to recognize what he was looking at when he saw it. You keep faith with the dead even when the living have given up on you. He paused. That's the oldest story there is. Andrew looked at Pete, then at Dax, then at his own hands. I want to go there, he said. Someday, not tonight, but someday. I want to see where he is. Dax looked at him for a moment. We'll take you, he said, when you're ready. Something in Andrew's posture changed at that. Something eased. The specific release of a tension that has been held so long you've forgotten. It was a choice that has become structural, load-bearing, and which, when it finally releases, takes you a moment to understand what has changed. Why everything feels different. Why the room looks the same, but the air in it has a different quality. Owen came forward from the back. He had been standing along the wall for the last several minutes with his coffee going cold in his hands and his face doing something complicated that May recognized as the specific expression of someone who has inherited a story and has just had the inheritance fundamentally revised. He was 22 years old. He had joined the club 22 months ago. He had inherited the mythology of Iron Rex Gallagher and William Armstrong, the way young members inherit all foundational mythology around fires, in the version that has been refined through 15 years of repetition, in the form that serves the anger that keeps a community cohesive when a community has been built around a wound. He had not questioned it. Why would he? The men who told it had been there. The anger in their voices was real, which meant the wound was real, which meant the story was real. Now he was standing in the Ironwood Saloon at 10 o'clock at night on a Tuesday in July, and the story had been revised down to its roots, and everything built on those roots had to be revised with it. He looked at Andrew. I want you to know, he said, that the version of your father I heard, the version I've been carrying since I joined this club, I want you to know I never felt right about it. He paused. I mean, I accepted it because why wouldn't I accept what the men who were there were telling me? But there was always something that didn't fit. What didn't fit, Andrew said. The keeping, Owen said. He looked at the notebook. If your father took the money and ran, why did he stay close? Why did he stay in Needles under his own name? Why did he not change his name and go somewhere the club had no reach and build a life and spend the money? He shook his head. I'm 22 and I figured that out, and I couldn't understand why no one else saw it. We saw it, Cruz said from along the wall. His voice was quiet. From the first year some of us saw it. He paused. But we were angry, and anger is easier to maintain than doubt. Doubt requires you to sit with not knowing, and not knowing is harder than being wrong. Andrew looked at Cruz. That's exactly what my dad wrote, he said. Cruz looked at him. What did he write? He wrote that he spent 15 years sitting with not knowing too. Not knowing if he'd made the right choice. Not knowing if Rex was dead or alive for the first year before he knew, and then knowing and not being able to say. He paused. He wrote that the not knowing was its own kind of company. Cruz was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I owe your father an apology I can't deliver. Andrew looked at him. I think he would say you don't, he said. I think he would say that if you'd known the truth, you would have known it. He looked at the notebook. He wrote about the people from the club. He never named them. But he wasn't angry. He understood why they believed what they believed. He just couldn't tell them otherwise. The room absorbed this. May thought about what it costs a person to understand the perspective of the people who are wrong about you. To look at the situation from outside your own position and see the logic of the wrong belief, to see why an absence of information in the right shape would naturally produce exactly the conclusion that people had reached about you. To hold that understanding alongside the full weight of the personal cost of being wrongly believed. She thought William Armstrong was not an ordinary man. She had served him coffee on Saturday mornings for 12 years and thought he was quiet, careful, methodical. She had not understood that what she was seeing was extraordinary discipline in a life that required it absolutely. She thought the desert makes certain kinds of people, or maybe certain kinds of people come to the desert. People who need space around them. People who need to be able to see in all directions. People who have learned that the places that tell the truth are the places worth living in even when the truth is hard. She thought about herself 27 years ago, choosing to stay in a cinder block building on a dying stretch of road because everything out here tells the truth eventually. She had said that so many times it had become involuntary. She had not known when she said it that she was saying it for a night like this one. Dax stood up. He stood at the edge of the booth, looking down at Andrew, and the room held the quality of its silence, not tense, not waiting the full silence of something arrived. He reached into his breast pocket and took out the pendant. He held it in both hands, looking at it. The silver was warm from being carried against his body. The inscription was visible in the bar light, worn smooth at the edges, from 20 years of handling, but still legible, still precise. Keep the faith. The road survives its kings. His father had had this made after his first term in federal prison. He had given it to the men he trusted absolutely, which were not many. He had given it to William Armstrong. He had been buried with it. And then he had not been buried with it because William Armstrong had gone back in the dark and done the last right thing available to him and had taken it from the place it should have been buried and had given it to a child to carry across 15 years of desert and a bar and needles on a Tuesday in July. He looked at Andrew. "This belongs in the club," he said. "My father made it for the club." He paused. "But you carried it here. You brought it to the right place." He set the pendant on the table in the center, equidistant between them. "What do you want to do with it?" The room understood that this was the moment. Not a ceremony, not a formal gesture, just the simple, final, irrevocable arrival of a thing at the place it had been trying to reach. Andrew looked at the pendant. He was quiet, and the quiet was the working quiet, the interior activity quiet of a 10-year-old boy doing the work of a much older person, weighing what he had received against what he had been carrying, against what the right next thing was. May watched his face and did not say anything. The room watched his face and did not say anything. Then he picked it up. He held it in his closed fist, the way he had held it at his father's funeral. The way a person holds something when they need it to be more than it is, and trust it anyway when the physical fact of it in the hand is the closest available substitute for the certainty they can't have any other way. His eyes closed. He was still for a long moment. Then his eyes opened. He held the pendant out to Dax. "My dad kept it safe," Andrew said. 15 years, for your family." His voice was steady and clear, the voice of a child who has done the accounting carefully and knows the numbers are right. "Now I'm giving it back for mine." He held Dax's gaze. The tired eyes, the ancient 10-year-old eyes, but with the new quality in them that had been developing all evening, the quality May had been watching arrive. "We're even," he said. The words settled in the Ironwood Saloon like the last note of a long piece of music. Even. The precision of it. The accounting of it. A child closing a ledger that two families had been bleeding into for 15 years with the same meticulous care his father had brought to every account he had ever kept. The same double-checking, the same satisfaction of the number landing in the right column, and the books closing clean. Dax took the pendant. He closed his hand around it and stood there for a moment looking down at Andrew, and the room held a specific quality of silence that arrives when something complete has been completed. Not the silence of waiting, not the silence of holding breath, but the full silence of a thing that has found its resolution. Then he did something that no one in that room had ever seen him do. Not Spike Briggs, who had ridden beside him since Dax was 20. Not Cruz, who had known him since Rex Gallagher first brought his 19-year-old son to a table and said, "Watch this one." Not Owen Roth, who had studied Dax for 22 months with the specific attention of a young man learning from the example he intended to follow. Dax reached down and put his hand on Andrew's head, not with the awkward, calculated tenderness of a man performing something he does not feel. Gently. With the specific naturalness of someone who has set aside every managed thing for the night and is working only from what is true. The way you put a hand on someone when words are the wrong instrument, when only presence will do. "Your father was not a thief," he said. The room was absolutely still. He was not a coward. He was not a traitor. He paused. He was the only man who followed an order all the way to its end at the cost of everything he had, and he did it right. And he kept it right for 15 years in the dark without anyone knowing, without any recognition, without any of the credit he was owed. Another pause. That is who your father was. Andrew sat still under the weight of that hand and received those words the way you receive something you have needed for longer than you could have known before tonight. Something that had been missing from the story you told about yourself and that has now finally been given back to you. Something in his posture released, not dramatically, slowly. The way a fist opens slowly when you've been holding it long enough and the reason for holding it is finally permanently gone. I know, he said barely above a whisper. I just needed you to know it too. Dax took his hand away. He stood up straight. He looked at the room. Every man's face was turned toward him. Every face showed him something different and something the same, the particular expression of men who have been inside, something that has changed them and who are carrying the change carefully, who are still integrating the weight of it, who are not the same people they were this morning. He nodded once. The nod that in the language of this particular group meant this is what happened here. We carry it forward correctly. We don't put it down. He started for the door. He stopped. He turned back to May. The coffee was good, he said. May looked at him across the length of the bar. 27 years of tending this place. 27 years of standing behind this counter, watching people tell the truth and fail to tell it and find their way back to it. 27 years of the desert, keeping its patience outside the window while she kept hers inside. Come back sometime, she said, when it's not an emergency. The corner of Dax Gallagher's mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was in that direction, and it was completely real. And it was the first, genuinely unguarded expression she had seen on his face all evening. Then he was through the door. They followed him in the quiet, sequential way they had been moving for the last hour. Not the territorial, organized occupation of arrival, but the human movement of departure of men, carrying something new and finding as they moved how to hold it, how to balance the weight of it, how to integrate it into the ongoing story of who they were. Briggs stopped at the booth. He put something on the table in front of Andrew. A piece of paper folded once. A phone number in block printing, careful and precise. For your mom, he said. If she needs anything, if you need anything. He looked at Andrew with a face that was fully open, every defense stripped away by the hours, by the desert, by the fundamental revision of everything he had believed. We owe your family more than a phone number, but it's what I've got right now. Andrew looked at it. Thank you, he said. Briggs stood there for another moment. He looked like a man who has more to say and understands that the more will have to wait, that this particular evening has held everything it can hold, and that some of the accounting will have to be done another day, in another conversation over a period of time long enough to do it properly. He walked out. Owen came last. He stopped at the door and turned back, and May watched him do the thing young people do when they have just been in the presence of something significant and are trying to figure out the right words for it, and are discovering that the right words may not exist yet, that the right words for some things arrive only after you have had time to live with the experience long enough to understand what it required of you. Hey, he said. Andrew looked at him. When you're old enough. He stopped. He reconsidered. He smiled, genuine and unguarded, the smile of a 22-year-old man who has just had his understanding of the world fundamentally revised and is still feeling the shape of the revision and finding to his own surprise that the revised version is better. Never mind, he said. You're already old enough. You were old enough tonight. Then he was gone. The engine started one by one in the staggered sequence that had become familiar over the course of this Tuesday, except entirely different in its character. Now, not the announcement of arrival, the organized declaration of a large force making itself known. The sound of departure, the sound of 89 men carrying something new into the desert dark toward whatever came next into the ongoing story of a life that had just been given a corrected foundation to stand on. The sound grew and then diminished and then was gone. The desert absorbed it the way the desert absorbed everything, without comment, without ceremony, patiently and completely. The Ironwood Saloon held its silence. One of the truckers said to no one in particular, with the genuine bewilderment of a man who fell asleep during one kind of story and woke up inside a completely different one. Somebody want to explain what just happened here? Pete Calloway set his book down on the table carefully, with the deliberateness of a man who understands that the book can wait and that what just happened cannot be made to wait anymore. Justice, he said, the slow kind. He looked at his cold coffee. Takes longer, but it lands harder. The trucker looked at him. That's all you've got. That's all there is, Pete said. He picked up his coffee and found it cold and set it back down and looked at May. Any chance of a fresh cup? May went behind the bar. She started the coffee. She moved through the familiar motions of it, filling the carafe, measuring the grounds, the specific sounds that the machine made when it began to heat. And she let the familiarity of it be what it was, which was the world being ordinary again. The ordinary world returning to the room after the extraordinary had passed through it, the way a room returns to itself after a window has been opened and closed. She looked at Andrew. He was sitting in his booth. He had the notebook in front of him, but he was not reading it. He was looking at the window at the dark desert outside it with the focused, unfocused look of someone whose eyes are pointed at the middle distance, but whose vision is directed inward at the interior landscape, where the night's events were still settling, still arranging themselves into the shape they would hold. He had the look of someone who has been carrying a load for a long time and has set it down and is discovering what that feels like, which is not what people expect it to feel like. People expect it to feel like relief, simple and clean. But the truth of setting down a long-carried weight is more complicated than relief. There is the relief, but there is also the strangeness of the absence of the familiar weight, the disorientation of the body that has organized itself around a burden and does not yet know what its new shape is. Andrew would figure out his new shape. He was 10 years old. He had his whole life to figure it out. And now he had the correct version of the story to do it with, which was the most important thing his father had been trying to give him, and had finally, through the notebook and the pendant, and a Tuesday afternoon in late July, managed to deliver. And it would take time. That was the thing about truth that nobody told you when they talked about how important it was. It took time to integrate, time to settle into the shape of a life that had been built without it. Time to go from the moment of revelation to the ordinary state of simply knowing. Andrew would have to tell his mother. He would have to sit with her in the kitchen in needles and tell her the whole story start to finish and watch her face do what faces do when they receive confirmation of something they believed against the evidence for a long time. And that would be its own hard thing, its own kind of grief and relief combined in the proportion that made them indistinguishable. He would have to grow up with this, with the knowledge that his father had been a man of extraordinary and private loyalty, with the knowledge that the world had been wrong about William Armstrong for 15 years and was now slowly, through whatever small corrections these things make in the lives of the people involved, going to be less wrong. With the knowledge that being right and being believed are different things, and that the time between them can be very long. He would carry that. It would be part of who he was. But he would carry it as truth, not as weight, as inheritance, not as burden, as the story of his father told correctly, the real story, the one that had been waiting 15 years in a notebook behind a kitchen baseboard and 40 years in the desert in the keeping of the most faithful guardian available, which was the desert itself. May poured herself a cup of coffee and came around the bar and sat down across from him. He looked at her. "You okay?" she said. He thought about it. He always thought about it. "Yeah," he said. "Just yeah. No qualification." The clean, certain answer of someone who has put something down and checked his hands and found them free. May looked at him. The tired eyes, the old young face, the particular quality of someone who has been carrying more than their years should contain and has been given back some portion of the years the carrying had used up. "Your mom is going to want to know all of this," she said. "I know." Andrew looked at the notebook. "I'll tell her everything." He paused. She always knew. He looked at the table. She never believed what people said, but she couldn't prove it. She just lived with not being able to prove it. "Now she can," May said. "Now she can," Andrew agreed. He looked out the window again. The first lightning of the desert horizon was still hours away, but the dark outside had changed in quality, had become the particular dark of very late night, rather than the absolute dark of midnight. The dark that has a suggestion of conclusion in it, that carries in its texture the possibility of what comes after. He wrote about the desert in the notebook, Andrew said, not in the part about the money or the directions. Earlier years earlier, he wrote about how it doesn't change, how a man can be gone for years and come back, and the same rock is still in the same place, and the same road is still the same road. He paused. He said it was the only thing he trusted. He looked at May. He said the desert keeps what you put in it. May thought about that. She thought about 27 years of standing behind this counter saying the desert doesn't let you hide it, just waits. She thought about what it meant to trust the desert, not as a metaphor, not as the observation of a woman who had chosen to stay in a hard place and needed a philosophy to justify the choosing, but as a literal practice, daily act of faith, trusting that what you put into it would be held, trusting that the keeping would be faithful, trusting that when the right person came to claim it, the desert would not have let it be lost. She thought about William Armstrong driving 40 minutes east in the dark with a shovel. She thought about the flat stone. She thought about a man doing the only right thing left available to him and trusting the desert with the rest. Your father put his faith in the right place, she said. Andrew looked at her, and something in his face did what it had been doing slowly all evening. Some final increment of the process that had been underway since Dax Gallagher walked through the door and the afternoon light found the pendant and the world began its long overdue correction. He looked at her with those eyes tired and present and newly clear. He did, Andrew said. They sat with that. Outside, the Mojave was enormous and permanent and patiently dark in the way of things that have been doing what they do for long enough that they have stopped needing to announce it. Stars and numbers, you could only see this far from city light, the sky showing its depth layer behind layer, the universe offering its scale to anyone who looked up and was willing to receive it. At some point, May realized she was not as aware of the time as she usually was in her own bar, not tracking the hour with the reflexive professional attention of a woman who has managed a business for 27 years and knows that every hour has its requirements. She was just there, just present. The way you are present in the moments that you understand will be the ones you come back to, the ones that define the territory between before and after. Pete Calloway paid his tab and put on his jacket and said goodnight with the specific grace of a man who knows when he has been in the presence of something that doesn't require his commentary and whose departure is itself a form of respect. The truckers stayed a little longer, drinking their coffee with the thoughtful silence of men who have witnessed something they know they won't talk about adequately for a long time, who are still processing, who are living inside the inadequacy of language and finding it strangely comfortable. Then they too were gone, and the ironwood was down to May and Andrew, and the hum of the refrigerator, in the particular silence of a place that has held a large thing and is now returning to itself. Andrew had his sketchbook out again. He was drawing the same concentrated absorption she had watched all summer, the absorption that was also his most natural form of being at peace. And she watched him for a while without saying anything. Then she looked out the window. The desert outside was beginning very slowly at the far edge of the world to lighten. Not sunrise yet, not even the suggestion of sunrise, but the first intimation of it, the way the sky starts to say what it is going to do before it does it, the way a door begins to open before the opening is visible. The jukebox clicked on, not because anyone touched it. The power to it had been cut hours ago, May's own hand on the cord, and she had not reconnected it. But the compressor in the beer cooler kicked on at that moment and sent a pulse through the old electrical system, and the jukebox, which was a machine of considerable age and thoroughly idiosyncratic character that had been a fixture of the Ironwood since before she bought it, and which had never in 27 years done exactly what it was supposed to do, and had occasionally done things no one could explain, found the last song in its queue. Waylon Jennings, slow and guitar heavy. The song that had been playing when the afternoon light hit the pendant and everything began. Andrew looked at the jukebox. He looked at May. Then he almost smiled. Not quite, but close. The expression of someone who has been pointed at the wrong direction for a long time and has just found the right one and is still getting used to how it feels to be facing correctly. The expression of a person standing at the edge of okay with their face pointed the right way for the first time in as long as they can remember. May reached across the table. She covered his hand with hers. Your father did his job, she said. For 15 years alone in the dark, without anyone knowing or acknowledging or thanking him for it. He did it right until the very end. She held his hand. Now you did yours. Andrew looked at her. The old young eyes, the desert light beginning to come in through the window gold at the edges, the specific gold of the Mojave in the hour when the sun is deciding. She looked at him and thought this boy is going to be all right. Not because the world is fair, it isn't, and not because the hard things are over, they aren't. But because he has his father's careful eyes and his father's steady hands and his father's understanding that you can carry a heavy thing with dignity and put it down when the time is right and trust the ground to hold it until it's needed. He is going to be all right because he already knows at 10 years old how to hold on and when to let go. Outside, the Mojave was turning gold at the edges, the way it always turned gold when the sun made its argument, and the argument was always the same and was always one. That light, given enough time, finds everything. Every buried thing, every kept secret, every act of loyalty that looked like abandonment, and every truth that wore a lie's face because the timing was not right yet. Every name that needed to be cleared. The desert had kept what William Armstrong put in it. The desert had kept faith. And in the corner booth of the Ironwood Saloon, as the morning came gold and enormous through the windows, a 10-year-old boy sat with his father's notebook in his hands, and his father's name finally clean. The name that was going to be carried forward now in its correct form, the form his father had always intended it to have, the form that all the years of careful solitary keeping had been in service of. The true form, the honest one. Andrew Ford, son of William Armstrong, the boy who had walked into a room full of the right-wrong people and said simply, my father wasn't a thief, and had been believed, and had been right. The jukebox played on. The gold light spread across the floor. The desert waited as it always waited, patient and enormous and faithfully itself, holding everything it had ever been given. Keeping what was put in it the way it had always kept things, the way it would go on. Keeping them long after this morning was memory and this morning's people were gone. Because the desert had learned in the long geological patience of its existence what the people passing through it spent lifetimes learning, that truth does not expire. It just waits for the right hands to come looking. And in the Ironwood Saloon, the right hands had come. The waiting was over, and the long desert morning was beginning.